October 14, 1943. Somewhere over the Dutch coast. High, so high the world below curves into a blue haze. In the cockpit of his brand new Focke-Wulf 190, Lieutenant Hans Schmidt feels invincible. He's young, he's sharp, he's been trained by the best air force in the world. And right now, his wingman's voice crackles over the radio, sharp, excited, bandits. 11 o'clock low. Hans's eyes scan, squinting against the sun. And then he sees them. The formation of American fighters, climbing, their silhouettes strange. Not the sleek, elegant lines of the Spitfire. Not the shark-like profile of his own Focke-Wulf. These are big, bulky, heavy. And Hans Schmidt smiles. He actually smiles. Because he recognizes this plane. They all do. The intelligence reports have been circulating for months. The pilots joke about it in the mess halls. They call it the Jug. Short Juggernaut? Something far less flattering. It looks like a milk bottle with wings. A flying bathtub. This, the report said, is America's great hope. This is what they're sending against the finest air force in the world? His gloved hand grips the stick. He signals to his wingman. This will be easy. A turkey shoot. He pushes the nose down, the wind screaming over his canopy. He's in a dive, the perfect German ambush, the boom and zoom. He picks his target, the lead Jug. Closes. 600 meters. 400. He can see the details now, the olive drab paint, the massive, circular engine cowling. His thumb rests on the trigger. 2 MG-131 machine guns and 2 devastating MG-151 20 cannons. Enough to shred anything in the sky. He takes a breath to fire, and in that split second, the entire American formation explodes into a maneuver the flight manual said was impossible. They don't turn, they snap turn. The lead plane, his target, is suddenly gone from his sights. And before his brain can even process it, before he can curse, before fear can even register, the sky around him disintegrates into a storm of steel. Not the pinpoint accuracy of cannon shells, but a literal cloud of lead, a hailstorm of .50 caliber rounds coming at a rate of over 6,000 per minute. Hans Schmidt has just made the last and worst mistake of his life. He underestimated the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. This is the story of one of the greatest underdog tales in military history. A story of American ingenuity meeting brutal necessity. A story of a plane laughed at, dismissed, and written off as a failure before it ever fired a shot in anger. A plane that would, against all odds, become one of the most deadly and versatile fighter bombers of the entire Second World War. A plane that would help tear the very heart out of the Luftwaffe. This is the story of how 8.50 caliber machine guns taught the arrogant aces of the Third Reich a lesson they would not live long enough to forget. Welcome, everyone. I want you to picture something. It's 1942. The world is on fire. In Europe, the Luftwaffe, battle-hardened from Spain, from Poland, from France, from the Battle of Britain, rules the skies. Their pilots are legends, knights of the air with kill counts in the hundreds. They fly machines of terrifying elegance, the nimble Messerschmitt Bf 109, the brutally powerful Focke-Wulf 190. To them, air combat is a science, a ballet of energy and angles. They are the masters. And then America arrives. Now, imagine you're one of those aces. You've heard whispers of American industry, this sleeping giant. You expect what? A superplane? A technological marvel to surpass the Focke-Wulf? And then you see the intelligence photos. Or maybe you see one, high above, through your canopy. And you laugh. Because the P-47 Thunderbolt is fat. Seriously. It was huge. It weighed 7 tons fully loaded. That's the weight of 2.5 modern SUVs, and we're trying to make it dogfight with a nimble Bf 109? Its wings were straight, not elegantly swept back. Its fuselage was barrel-shaped. It was built around the largest, most powerful air-cooled radial engine ever fitted to a fighter at the time, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. This thing wasn't just a plane, it was a flying power plant. The German assessment was swift and unanimous. Shorefallig, clumsy, a sitting duck. They believed it couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't be a threat to their superior technology and tactics. They wrote it off. They dismissed it. And in war, as in life, underestimation is a poison. It's a slow-acting venom that clouds your judgment, that makes you arrogant, that makes you make fatal mistakes. This video is the story of that fatal miscalculation. We're going to climb into the cockpits of both the hunter and the hunted. We're going to feel the frustration of the young American pilots, thrown into combat in a plane they didn't fully understand, against the deadliest air force on the planet. We're going to witness the birth of new tactics, born of desperation and American pragmatism. We're going to be there when the jug stops being the joke and starts writing its name in fire across the skies of Europe. And it all starts not in the air over Germany, but on a drafting board in New York, with two brilliant, stubborn men who looked at the rules of air combat and decided to tear them up. To understand the Thunderbolt, you have to understand the minds that created it. This isn't a story of a committee design. This is a story of vision. The vision of Alexander Kartveli and Alexander de Seversky. Now, Kartveli, there's a name. Born Alexander Kartvelishvili in Tbilisi, Georgia, then part of the Russian Empire. He wasn't some Ivy League theoretician. He was a man forged in the crucible of revolution and exile. He'd seen war, he'd seen chaos. He escaped the Bolsheviks and ended up in New York, a brilliant engineer with a heavy accent and a singular focus, to build the best damn fighter plane in the world. His partner, and the founder of Republic Aviation, was Alexander de Seversky. Another immigrant, a Russian-born ace from the First World War who had lost a leg, but not his nerve or his brilliance. He was a showman, a theorist, a man who believed in the transformative power of air power. So you have these two Alexanders, these two immigrants who had fled tyranny, now working for their adopted country, tasked with a simple, impossible mission: build a war-winning fighter. And everyone knew what a fighter was supposed to be in 1940. It was supposed to be light, agile, and nimble. It was supposed to turn on a dime. The Spitfire was the gold standard. But Kartveli looked at the data coming from Europe and he saw something else. He saw that the era of the biplane dogfight was over. Combat was happening at higher and higher altitudes. Speed was life. And survivability, that was the real key. His philosophy was brutal, simple, and utterly revolutionary. A fighter that is not built to take a punch will not live long enough to throw one. So, while the British were perfecting the delicate art of the turning dogfight, and the Germans were layering on more and more cannons, Kartveli went in the opposite direction. He decided to build a tank that could fly. The engine was non-negotiable. It had to be the R-2800. This thing was a beast, a 18-cylinder radial that could churn out over 2,000 horsepower. It was so massive it dictated the entire design of the plane. To get that power to the propeller, you needed a massive, four-bladed Curtiss electric propeller. And to house that engine and propeller, you needed a huge, round fuselage. Hence, the jug. But here's where the genius kicks in. That big, bulky fuselage? It wasn't just empty space. It was strength. It was armor. The pilot sat in a veritable fortress. The cockpit was surrounded by toughened glass and armor plate. The engine itself, a massive radial, was incredibly resilient to battle damage. Unlike liquid-cooled engines like the Merlin in the Mustang or the Daimler-Benz in the 109, which could be knocked out by a single bullet in the radiator, the R-2800 could have multiple cylinders shot away and keep running. And then, there were the guns. Early war fighters typically had a mix of light machine guns and heavier cannons. The Americans standardized. Kartveli's initial design had 4.50 calories. But he looked at it and thought, it's not enough. So he doubled it. 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns. Let's just sit with that for a second. Each of those guns could fire about 800 rounds per minute. Do the math. That's over 6,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition pouring downrange every 60 seconds. And they weren't firing just any bullet. They had a mix of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds. A 2-second burst from a P-47 was the equivalent of throwing a solid trash can full of lead and fire at your enemy. It didn't just shoot at enemy planes, it erased them. But there was a problem. A huge one. All this strength, All this armor, all this ammunition, it was heavy. So heavy. The early P-47s were pigs at low altitude. They couldn't climb with the 109s. They certainly couldn't turn with them. And this leads us to the first and most painful chapter of the Thunderbolt story, its baptism of fire. The first P-47s arrived in England in early 1943. They were assigned to the 4th Fighter Group, a unit with a unique history. These were the former Eagle squadrons, American volunteers who had been flying Spitfires for the Royal Air Force before the US even entered the war. These guys weren't rookies. They were seasoned, cynical, and they knew the Spitfire inside and out. The Spitfire was a sports car, responsive, graceful, a joy to fly. And then they were told to trade it in for this. I want you to meet a young pilot. Let's call him Lieutenant Jim McLaren. He's 22 years old, from Ohio. He's got 50 missions in a Spitfire under his belt. He's confident, maybe a little cocky. He walks out to his new steed, the P-47D, and his heart sinks. He has to climb up onto the wing to get into the cockpit. The Spitfire, you just hopped in. Everything about the jug feels wrong. The controls are heavy. You need muscle to move the ailerons. The cockpit is roomy, sure, but it feels like you're sitting in an office, not a fighter plane. His first flight is a disaster. He takes off, and the plane wallows into the air. It feels like flying a truck. He tries a mock dogfight with a Spitfire. It's a humiliation. The Spitfire dances around him, sitting on his tail, its pilot probably laughing over the radio. Mac can't climb to catch it. He can't turn to get away. He's a flying target. He lands, slams the canopy back, and storms into the debrief. The stories are all the same. The pilots are furious. They feel like they've been given a death sentence. They call it the Republican. They write letters home complaining. Morale plummets. And the Germans? They get their first confirmed looks at the P-47, and their intelligence reports confirm everything the American pilots fear. One captured German report, which we can read today, stated, and I'm paraphrasing, the Thunderbolt is inferior in all aspects of maneuverability to both the Bf-109 and the FW-190. It cannot climb. It cannot turn. It is only dangerous in a straight line. The Luftwaffe aces were briefed. If you meet a P-47, do not fear it. Draw it into a turning fight. It will be easy prey. And for months, they were right. The early combat reports are heartbreaking to read. Young American pilots, trained in the old ways, trying to turn with 109s. It was a slaughter. The jug would slow down, its immense weight making it a stable gun platform for about 2 seconds, before it would stall, or simply be too slow to follow the nimble German fighter. And then the cannon shells would rip in. Losses mounted. The pilots were scared. They were losing faith in their machine. They started to believe the German propaganda, the jokes. They started to believe they were flying a lemon. Command was getting nervous. Was the P-47 a billion-dollar mistake? Was the entire fighter strategy for Europe flawed? But in the midst of this despair, a few brilliant minds were watching and learning. Men like Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group. Zemke was a thinker. He wasn't emotional. He looked at the loss reports, the performance charts, and he saw something else. He saw a pattern. The P-47 wasn't failing because it was a bad plane. It was failing because they were trying to use a sledgehammer to do a scalpel's job. They were fighting the Germans' fight. And Zemke realized, you never, ever fight your enemy on his own terms. He gathered his pilots. The mood was grim, and he laid it out for them. All right, listen up. I know what you're all thinking. I know you think this plane is a pig. And you're right. It is. It can't turn with a 109. It can't climb with one, not down here. So stop trying. From now on, we fight our fight. Not theirs. Look at the books. Look at the data. This thing, this jug, it's a rocket ship in a dive. Nothing, and I mean nothing the Germans have can catch us once we point the nose down. And up high, above 25,000 feet, this big, beautiful engine starts to sing. It comes alive. That's our sky. Not down here in the mud. Up there, in the thin, cold air. He was talking about a radical new doctrine. The boom and zoom. No more turning. You use your superior speed and power in the vertical. You dive on your enemy from the sun, a single, devastating pass with all 8 guns, the boom. Then, you use your incredible speed to climb away, back to altitude, safe from reprisal, the zoom. It was hit and run. It was brutal, efficient, and it played to every single one of the Thunderbolt's hidden strengths. It was a revelation. It was like giving a master key to a locked door. The pilots started training not in horizontal scissors, but in steep dives, in high-side attacks, in using the throttle and the stick to manage energy, not angles. They were no longer pilots of a failed fighter. They were pilots of a high-altitude energy fighter. They were learning to speak the Thunderbolt's language. And just in time. Because in the summer of 1943, the USAF was about to bet the farm on a gamble so audacious it would either win the air war, or see the entire 8th Air Force bleed itself white over the fields of France. They were going to send the bombers deep. To Schweinfurt. To Regensburg. To the heart of the German war machine. And the P-47s, the so-called failures, were going to be their only shield against the fury of the entire Luftwaffe. The new tactics weren't just theory. They were about to be tested in the most brutal laboratory imaginable, the air over Western Europe. The American 8th Air Force was committed to daylight precision bombing. It was a doctrine of terrifying cost. The B-17 flying fortresses would go in, unescorted, deep into Germany, and the Luftwaffe was waiting for them like wolves around a wounded caribou. The early P-47s, with their short-range belly tanks, could only escort the bombers so far, to the Dutch border, maybe. And then they had to turn back. The German controllers knew this. They'd wait. They'd let the jugs leave, and then they'd pounce on the now defenseless bombers. The American air crews called that point the point of no return. They watched their little friends, the fighters, peel away, and a cold dread would settle in the cabin. They were on their own. But with the new boom and zoom tactics, even on these short-range missions, the P-47s started to even the score. Let's go back to our pilot mech. He's been training with Zemke's new doctrine. He's skeptical, but he's a professional. Today's mission, escort B-17s to Antwerp. As they approach the coast, the call comes, bandits. Bandits everywhere. 11 o'clock high. Mac looks up. A swarm of FW-190s, the sun glinting off their wings, are diving on the bomber stream. The old fear, the instinct to turn and fight, rises in his throat. But he hears Zemke's voice in his head. Fight or fight. He keys his mic, his voice tight. Yellow flight climb, gain altitude. We bounce them on the way out. He shoves the throttle forward. The big R-2800 roars, the turbocharger kicking in with a whine. The jug starts to climb, not with the grace of a 190, but with a relentless, brute force determination. He keeps his speed up, trading it for altitude. He's soon 1,000, then 2,000 feet above the dogfight. He looks down. It's chaos. Tracers lace the sky. AB-17, hit in the wing, is spinning down, a trail of black smoke and parachutes behind it. And there he sees his target. A Focke-Wulf 190, painted in splintered camouflage, has just made a pass on a bomber and is now pulling up, slow, vulnerable. The pilot may be scanning his 6 for other fighters, but not looking up. Mac rolls the jug inverted. For a second, he's looking straight down at the earth, the world a dizzying blue and green blur. He pulls the stick back. The nose drops. The G-forces push him into his seat. The airspeed needle starts to wind up, 350, 400, 450 miles per hour. The wind is screaming now, a high-pitched shriek. He's a falcon in a stoop. The FW-190 fills his reflector sight. He can see the details, the black cross, the yellow nose. He's coming in so fast the German pilot has no idea he's there. He waits. He waits until he's so close it feels like a collision is inevitable. His thumb finds the red trigger button on his stick. He takes a breath. And he fires. The effect is instantaneous and horrific. The .50 caliber shells don't just punch holes. They disassemble the Focke-Wulf. The cockpit shatters. The engine cowling tears away. A wing folds back. The plane, a second ago a masterpiece of engineering, is now a cloud of fragments, a fireball, and a long, falling smear of smoke and debris. Mac doesn't see the pilot get out. He doesn't have time. He's already pulling back on the stick with all his might, the G-forces crushing him, his vision graying at the edges. The big jug groans, but it holds together. It pulls out of the dive and starts to climb, its speed converting back into precious altitude. He's safe. He's untouched. He looks back. The bomber formation is still taking a beating, but his flight has just evened the odds by 1. A voice crackles in his headset, a bomber crewman, his voice cracking with emotion. "Thanks, little friend. Sweet Jesus, thanks." That was the moment. That was the turning point. All across the 4th and the 56th Fighter Groups, pilots were having the same experience. The Germans, confident in their superiority, were following their old playbook. They'd see a P-47 and try to lure it into a turn. But the jugs wouldn't turn. They'd dive away, impossibly fast, or they'd climb, and then come screaming back down out of the sun. The kill ratios started to shift. The P-47, the plane written off as a failure, started to rack up victories. Pilots like Francis, Gabby, Gabreski, and Roberts Johnson, flying jugs, began to climb the ace ladder, their scores built on the foundation of this new, ruthless tactic. The Germans were confused. Their intelligence was wrong. This plane wasn't clumsy. In its element, it was a predator. But they were still confident. It was a fluke, they thought. A temporary setback. The real key was range. As long as the Thunderbolt couldn't follow the bombers all the way to Germany, the Luftwaffe still held the advantage. They didn't know that back in the States, and in modification centers across England, American engineers were working on a simple, almost laughably low-tech solution that would transform the P-47 from a defensive escort into an offensive hunter. A solution that would give the jug the one thing it needed to become a legend. They were bolting a gas tank to its belly. Pacing slows, becoming reflective but with a building undercurrent of anticipation. So, by the end of 1943, the narrative was shifting. The P-47 was no longer a joke. It was a respected and feared opponent in the medium-altitude battles over the coast. The American pilots had found their rhythm. They had learned to speak their plane's language of power and speed. They had bloodied the nose of the Luftwaffe. But it was still a defensive war for the fighters. They were reacting. They were waiting for the Germans to come to them. All of that was about to change. Because with the new belly tanks, the P-47s could now fly deeper into Fortress Europe than any Allied fighter before them. They weren't just escorting the bombers to the target. They were going to escort them over the target. They were going to take the fight directly to the Luftwaffe's front door. Imagine the scene in a German fighter base in early 1944. The veterans are getting nervous. The new replacements are hearing whispers. Be careful of the J-bows, the fighter bombers. The big ones. Don't try to turn with them below 20,000 feet. And for God's sake, never ever follow one in a dive. The old aces, the ones with the Knight's Crosses and the 100+ kills, they scoff. They'd seen new weapons come and go. They believed in their own skill, in the superiority of German engineering. They still saw the Thunderbolt as a crude, American brute force solution, a plane without finesse. They had no idea what was coming. They didn't know that the P-47 was about to evolve again, from a high-altitude escort fighter into the deadliest ground attack aircraft of the war. They didn't know that soon, the skies over their own airfields would be dark with jugs, not just dropping bombs and firing rockets, but waiting, hunting for them to take off. The era of the American hunter had begun. The Luftwaffe had dismissed the Thunderbolt. Soon, they would have nowhere to hide from it. In our next part, we dive into the heyday of the jug. We'll be in the cockpit as the 8th and 9th Air Forces take the war to the German heartland. We'll see how a simple piece of plumbing, a new water injection system, unleashed even more hidden power. We'll witness the rise of the true aces of the Thunderbolt, men who would become legends. And we'll be there for one of the most lopsided aerial massacres of the entire war, a day the Germans would come to call the Black Thursday. Don't you dare miss it. So, by the end of 1943, the narrative was shifting. The P-47 was no longer a joke. It was a respected and feared opponent in the medium-altitude battles over the coast. The American pilots had found their rhythm. They had learned to speak their plane's language of power and speed. They had bloodied the nose of the Luftwaffe, but it was still a defensive war for the fighters. They were reacting. They were waiting for the Germans to come to them. All of that was about to change. Because with the new belly tanks, the P-47s could now fly deeper into Fortress Europe than any Allied fighter before them. They weren't just escorting the bombers to the target. They were going to escort them over the target. They were going to take the fight directly to the Luftwaffe's front door. Imagine the scene in a German fighter base in early 1944. The veterans are getting nervous. The new replacements are hearing whispers. Be careful of the J-bows, the fighter bombers. The big ones. Don't try to turn with them below 20,000 feet. And for God's sake, never ever follow one in a dive. The old aces, the ones with the Knight's Crosses and the 100+ kills, they scoff. They'd seen new weapons come and go. They believed in their own skill, in the superiority of German engineering. They still saw the Thunderbolt as a crude, American brute force solution, a plane without finesse. They had no idea what was coming. They didn't know that the P-47 was about to evolve again, from a high-altitude escort fighter into the deadliest ground attack aircraft of the war. They didn't know that soon, the skies over their own airfields would be dark with jugs, not just dropping bombs and firing rockets, but waiting, hunting for them to take off. The era of the American hunter had begun. The Luftwaffe had dismissed the Thunderbolt. Soon, they would have nowhere to hide from it. In our next part, we dive into the heyday of the Jug. We'll be in the cockpit as the 8th and 9th Air Forces take the war to the German heartland. We'll see how a simple piece of plumbing, a new water injection system, unleashed even more hidden power. We'll witness the rise of the true aces of the Thunderbolt, men who would become legends. And we'll be there for one of the most lopsided aerial massacres of the entire war, a day the Germans would come to call the Black Thursday. The problem was simple, and it was measured in gallons. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a fuel-hungry monster. That massive R-2800 engine gulped high-octane aviation fuel like a man dying of thirst. And that meant range, or the lack of it. For all its newfound prowess, the Jug was still on a leash. It could only follow the bomber stream so far before the fuel gauges dipped dangerously low and the pilots had to utter those two dreaded words over the radio: bingo fuel. Time to go home. And the Germans knew it. They'd watch, they'd wait, holding their interceptors back until the last Thunderbolt had turned for England. Then they'd pounce. The bomber crews called it the Little Friend's Farewell, and it was the most terrifying part of any deep penetration mission. You'd watch your protection vanish over the horizon, and you'd be alone in a sky that was about to become a shooting gallery. Something had to change. The entire premise of daylight precision bombing was at stake. You can't break a country's industrial backbone if you can't get to it. The solution wasn't some revolutionary new engine design. It was brilliantly, almost comically, simple. A tank. An extra fuel tank. They started by trying to fit a tank in the fuselage behind the pilot, but that messed with the center of gravity. Then someone had the idea: just hang it underneath. The first were 200-gallon paper tanks. Yes, paper. Treated with a plastic resin to keep them from leaking, they were cheap, disposable, and when they were empty, you could just jettison them with the flick of a switch. They were nicknamed baby's bottoms because of their smooth shape. Later came metal 75-gallon and 150-gallon drop tanks. It was low-tech, pragmatic, and it utterly transformed the air war. The effect was immediate and psychological as much as it was tactical. The first time a formation of P-47s, sporting these new belly tumors, didn't turn back at the Dutch border, you can bet it caused panic in the German control rooms. The radar operators must have been stunned. The Jugs were still there. Deeper. And deeper still. Now, the hunters became the hunted. The American fighters were no longer just bodyguards, they were prowlers. They could fly ahead of the bomber streams, sweeping the skies clean in what they called fighter sweeps. They could loiter over known German fighter bases, a tactic called rat catching, waiting for the Luftwaffe to scramble. They'd catch them at their most vulnerable, low, slow, climbing out with their gear down and their flaps set, fuel heavy and clumsy. This was a new kind of terror for the Luftwaffe. Their home fields were no longer sanctuaries. The front line was now everywhere. And the Thunderbolt itself was evolving. The engineers at Republic weren't sleeping. They saw the reports, they listened to the pilots, and they kept refining the beast. The P-47D, the workhorse, received a new, bulbous cockpit canopy they called the bubble canopy. It replaced the old Razorback design, and it gave the pilot a glorious 360-degree view. For the first time, a Jug pilot could check his 6 without craning his neck, without the blind spots that had gotten so many of his friends killed. It was like someone had taken a blindfold off. Then came the water injection. A system that injected a water and alcohol mixture directly into the cylinders right before the supercharger kicked in. It cooled the charge, allowing for a massive, temporary boost in power. With war emergency power engaged, a late-model P-47D could push out over 2,600 horsepower. It was a nitrous oxide shot for an already muscular engine. The climb rate, once the Jug's greatest weakness, became respectable. Not Spitfire level, but good enough to get you to the fight faster, to gain that crucial altitude advantage. The plane was shedding its flaws, one by one. It was becoming the weapon Cartvelli had always envisioned. And the men flying them? They were becoming legends. Take a guy like Robert Johnson. In May 1944, he was jumped by a formation of FW-190s. His Thunderbolt was savaged. His hydraulic system was shot out, filling the cockpit with fluid and smoke. His rudder cables were partially severed. His canopy was shattered. He was wounded. And yet, the Jug kept flying. He used trim tabs to control the plane, diving away from his attackers in that legendary Thunderbolt dive. He made it back to England, his plane so riddled with holes that ground crew counted over 200 bullet and cannon strikes. It was a testament to the plane's brutal resilience. A lesser aircraft would have been confetti. Then there was Francis Gabi Gabreski, the son of Polish immigrants, a cool, calculating killer in the cockpit. He understood the boom and zoom doctrine better than almost anyone. His score climbed steadily, methodically. He wasn't a flashy pilot, he was an efficient one. He was a surgeon, and the Thunderbolt was his scalpel. But these aces, these legends, they weren't just scoring kills in fair fights. They were dismantling an air force. And the moment that truly broke the back of the Luftwaffe in the West, the day the Thunderbolt's fury was fully unleashed, didn't happen over a German city. It happened over a field in France on a clear spring day. A day that would go down in history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot of the European theater. The Germans called it Der Schwarz-Donnerstag, Black Thursday. It was April 13, 1944. The target for the American bombers was the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the aircraft production facilities at Augsburg. The Luftwaffe knew it was coming. They decided to throw everything they had, every single fighter they could scramble, into one massive, decisive interception. They would break the 8th Air Force once and for all. What followed was one of the largest, most chaotic air battles in history. Over 1,000 bombers, and nearly as many German fighters, filled the sky. And waiting for them, flying high cover, were groups of P-47 Thunderbolts, now with the range to be there for the whole party. The German pilots, under immense pressure to stop the bombers at any cost, made a fatal error. They broke their own discipline. They focused on the B-17s and B-24s, lining up for slow, steady firing passes. They ignored their own cardinal rule: always check your 6. The Thunderbolt pilots saw their chance. It was a turkey shoot. From 5 miles above, the Jugs dove into the fray. They came down in elements of 2, in flights of 4, a waterfall of olive drab and silver. They didn't bother with fancy maneuvers. It was pure, unadulterated boom and zoom. A pilot would pick a target, a 109 or a 190 lining up on a bomber, dive, fire a 2-second burst from his 8 guns, and then climb away, his speed carrying him back to safety. Then he'd roll over and do it again. The sky was a scribble of contrails and tracer fire. The radio channels were a bedlam of shouts, warnings, and victory cries. The .50 caliber rounds chewed through German formations. A pilot would see the aircraft ahead of him simply disintegrate, and then feel the hammer blows of fire on his own plane a second later. One Thunderbolt pilot, Captain Walker Bud Mahurin later described it, "It was like shooting rabbits in a barrel. They were so intent on killing bombers they forgot we were there. We just slaughtered them." The numbers were staggering. The USAF claimed over 60 German aircraft shot down that day for the loss of only a handful of P-47s. Post-war records confirmed it was a catastrophe for the Luftwaffe. They had lost not just planes, but a generation of experienced pilots and squadron leaders. You can replace a Messerschmitt in a factory. You cannot replace a battle-hardened ace in a few weeks. Black Thursday was a psychological turning point. After that, the Luftwaffe never truly recovered its offensive spirit. The initiative had been permanently wrested away. The Jugs had proven they could not only protect the bombers, but they could systematically destroy the enemy's ability to fight back. But the story of the Jug doesn't end in the thin, cold air at 30,000 feet. Its final and in many ways most brutal transformation was about to happen. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, the Thunderbolt was handed a new, dirtier job. It was ordered to come down out of its lofty kingdom and get its hands dirty in the mud and the blood of the battlefield. The high-altitude ace was about to become the GI's best friend, the tanker's nightmare, and the most feared thing in the sky for any German soldier on the ground. The Jug was going to war on the deck. The aftermath of Black Thursday settled over the Luftwaffe not like a fog, but like a shroud. The airfields of France and Germany, once bustling with arrogant energy, were now places of quiet dread. The mess hall jokes about the J-bow were gone, replaced by a grim, knowing silence. The veterans would look at the fresh-faced replacements, boys who had trained on fuel so scarce they barely learned to land, and they'd just shake their heads. They knew what was waiting for them up there. It wasn't just the loss of the planes. It was the loss of the men. The the experts, the squadron leaders with the intuitive feel for the fight. They were irreplaceable. A new pilot could be taught to fly, but he couldn't be taught the 1,000 little instincts that kept you alive in a sky full of 8.50 caliber guns. The German fighter arm was bleeding out, not from 1,000 cuts, but from a series of brutal, systematic amputations performed by the Thunderbolt. And the P-47 pilots? Their confidence was now a tangible force. They had a swagger. They had painted sharks' teeth on the noses of their Jugs. They gave their planes names like Wicked Wabbit and Big Stud. They weren't just defending bombers anymore. They were actively seeking out the fight. They believed, with every fiber of their being, that they were flying the best fighter in the sky. But even as they ruled the high air, a new storm was gathering on the horizon. A storm of a different kind. In England, the fields were filling up with an invasion army. Mountains of supplies, oceans of fuel, and millions of men waited for the order. And everyone knew, from General Eisenhower down to the lowest private, that for Overlord to succeed, for the beaches of Normandy not to become a slaughterhouse, the Allies needed absolute control of the skies over the battlefield. Not just control of the high-altitude bomber streams. Control of the hedgerows. Control of the road junctions. Control of the panzer divisions that would be rushing to throw the invaders back into the sea. The high-altitude duel between fighters was about to become a low-level war of attrition. And the P-47, the mighty Jug, was about to be handed its dirtiest, most dangerous, and most vital assignment yet. It was ordered to come down from the heavens and get its wings muddy. The fighter pilots, the knights of the air, were initially skeptical. This was beneath them. They were ace makers, tank busters. They were supposed to strafe trains and shoot up trucks. It seemed like a waste, but they had no idea that the Thunderbolt, in its incredible versatility, was about to prove it was just as deadly looking down as it was looking up. The modifications came quickly. Bomb racks were fitted under the wings and the belly. The Jugs could now carry a heavier bomb load than some medium bombers. Then came the high-velocity aircraft rockets, or VARs. The pilots called them Holy Moses rockets. One hit from a Holy Moses could obliterate a tank, a bunker, a locomotive. The tactics changed overnight. They developed the Thunderbolt roll. A 4-ship flight would approach a target, a convoy, a rail yard, in a line. The lead plane would roll in, fire its rockets, drop its bombs, then strafe with its guns. As he pulled up, The number 2 man was already rolling in. Then 3. Then 4. It was a continuous, rolling wave of destruction that could saturate an area in minutes, leaving nothing but fire and shattered metal. The effect on German ground forces was apocalyptic. A soldier or a tank crew caught in the open by a flight of jugs had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The 8.50s, firing over 6,000 rounds a minute, could literally mow down entire columns of infantry. The rockets could punch through the thinner top armor of any panzer. The bombs could collapse bridges and block roads. The P-47 became the most feared sight in the European theater for the German soldier. They called it the J-bows, a term filled with a terror that no high-altitude interceptor could ever inspire. The terror was personal. It was immediate. And the pilots, once they saw the results, understood. They saw the panzers they stopped from reaching the beaches. They saw the supply trains they blew up before they could feed the German war machine. They weren't just scoring aerial victories anymore. They were saving the lives of the guys on the ground. They were helping to win the war. The Thunderbolt had become the complete warrior. It could duel with the best fighters the Luftwaffe had to offer at 30,000 feet, and then dive down to the deck and destroy a locomotive with a 5-second burst. It was the Swiss Army knife of the Allied air forces, and every tool it had was sharpened to a razor's edge. But this new, brutal role came at a terrible cost. The German anti-aircraft guns were everywhere, and at low altitude, the Thunderbolt was a big, slow target. The losses mounted. The pilots who had survived the deadly fighter sweeps now found themselves in a new kind of lottery, dodging thousands of black puffs of smoke and invisible sides of steel reaching up from the ground. It was a dirty, dangerous, and unglamorous job. But it was a job that had to be done. And the P-47, the unkillable beast, was the only plane tough enough to do it. In our next part, we descend into the hell of low-altitude warfare. We'll fly on the deck through storms of flak, hunting tanks in the hedgerows of Normandy. We'll witness the ultimate test of the Jug's legendary durability as pilots bring them home shot to pieces. And we'll meet the men who flew these brutal missions, the ground attack pilots, whose courage and sacrifice against the deadly AK would forever cement the P-47's legacy not just as an ace-maker, but as the GI's most powerful guardian angel. The shift from the pristine, thin air of the stratosphere to the muddy, chaotic hell of the battlefield was a shock to the system. For the pilots, it was a different world. At 30,000 feet, combat was a chess match of energy and angles, a cold, intellectual exercise. Down on the deck, it was a bar fight. It was visceral. You could smell it, the cordite from the flak, the smoke from burning fields and villages. You could see the faces of the men you were shooting at. And the flak, my God, the flak. It wasn't just the big 88s that the bombers feared. It was the light stuff. The 20mm and 37mm automatic cannons. The machine guns mounted on trucks. It all reached up for you. The sky would suddenly blossom with these ugly, black, cotton ball puffs, each one a cloud of red-hot steel shrapnel. And then you'd hear the thump-thump-thump against your fuselage, like rocks being thrown against a tin shed. You were flying fast, treetop level, your prop kicking up dust from the fields, your shadow racing alongside you. Your heart was pounding in your throat. You'd see a target, a camouflage tank hiding under a tree, a staff car speeding down a road, a train trying to make a run for it. You had seconds to make your decision. Line up, pickle off your bombs, fire your rockets. Then, the hardest part, you had to fly straight and level for that strafing run. You had to make yourself a target for every German with a rifle. It was during this time that the legend of the Jug's toughness was written in blood and aluminum. Pilots brought back planes that were barely recognizable. Wings with gaping holes you could climb through. Tail sections shredded. Cylinders shot off the massive radial engine, oil spewing back over the canopy, blinding them. And yet, the damn things kept flying. There's one story, almost a myth now, but verified by ground crews. A pilot named Lieutenant John Jack B. Murphy was hit by flak during a strafing run on a marshalling yard. A 37mm shell exploded just under his cockpit, tearing a hole large enough to see through. His hydraulics were gone. His electrical systems were fried. His radio was dead. He was losing fuel and oil. But the engine, missing 2 cylinders, kept chugging along. He couldn't retract his landing gear. He couldn't flaps. He just pointed the nose towards the channel and prayed. He made it to the English coast, a trail of smoke marking his path. He lined up for a dead-stick landing, no hydraulics, no brakes. He hit the runway, the metal-on-metal scream echoing across the field. He ground to a stop, climbed out on shaking legs, and looked at his plane. The ground crew just stared. It was a colander with wings. One of them later said, any other plane would have been a footnote. The jug brought him home. This was the bond that formed between the pilots and their machines. It wasn't just a tool, it was a member of the crew. It was the thing that hugged you in a cocoon of armor plate, that absorbed punishment that would have torn a lighter plane to pieces, that used its sheer, brute force mass to carry you through hell and back. And the impact on the German war machine was catastrophic. The Thunderbolts of the 9th Air Force became the scalpel of the Allied advance. When a panzer division was reported moving towards the front, the jugs were scrambled to work over the roads. They'd crater them with bombs, destroy bridges, and then systematically hunt the tanks, now stuck in traffic jams of their own making, with rockets and .50 caliber fire. They crippled logistics. They destroyed ammunition dumps. They strafed airfields, destroying planes on the ground. They made daylight movement for the German army a suicidal gamble. The P-47 had become the most versatile weapon in the Allied arsenal. It had cleared the skies of the Luftwaffe, and now it was systematically dismantling the Wehrmacht on the ground. It was the key that unlocked the stalemate of the Normandy hedgerows and sent the Allied armies racing across France. But even as the Thunderbolt reigned supreme over Western Europe, a new and even more formidable challenge was emerging in the east. A new German weapon, a jet fighter, was entering the fray. It was faster than anything the Allies had. It flew on a whisper, leaving propeller-driven planes in its wake. It was the future, and it threatened to make every P-47, every P-51, every Spitfire, obsolete overnight. The ultimate test of American ingenuity and the Thunderbolt's brutal effectiveness was not yet over. The final, shocking confrontation between the past and the future of aerial combat was just beginning. In our final part, we face the jet. We'll witness the dawn of the jet age over the battlefields of Europe and see how the humble, prop-driven Thunderbolt, the plane everyone had laughed at, was tasked with taking down this technological terror. We'll see if the lessons learned in the hard school of combat and the raw, unrefined power of the jug could stand against a machine that leaped a generation ahead. The stage is set for the last, great battle of the P-47 Thunderbolt. The first sighting reports were treated with disbelief. Pilots returning from missions over Germany would stammer about seeing something impossible. A plane with no propeller. A shape like a shark, moving with a silent, terrifying speed that made their own Thunderbolts feel like they were standing still. It left a thin, ghostly trail of kerosene smoke, and its engine made a sound they'd never heard before. Not a roar, but a whining, ethereal whistle. The whisper of death. It was the Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe, the Swallow, the world's first operational jet fighter. For the P-47 pilots who had mastered the skies, this was a gut punch. All their hard-won knowledge, their tactics, their confidence, felt suddenly obsolete. How do you boom and zoom on a plane that can outrun your dive? How do you escape an enemy that can climb away from you like you're parked on the tarmac? The German propaganda machine went into overdrive. They claimed the jet would sweep the Allies from the skies, that the war would be turned on its head. For a few terrifying weeks in the autumn of 1944, it seemed they might be right. The initial encounters were brutal and one-sided. A flight of jugs would be patrolling, and with no warning, 2 silver darts would slash through their formation at over 500 miles per hour, the 4 30mm cannons in the Me-262's nose ripping a bomber, or a fellow Thunderbolt, to pieces before anyone could even scream a warning. Then the jets would simply thrive. They'd climb away, untouchable. The frustration was maddening. The old aces, the men like Gabreski and Johnson, they gathered their pilots. The mood was grim. "All right, listen up," they'd say, leaning on a wing. "The rules have changed. But we haven't. The jet is faster. It is. But it's not a god. It has weaknesses. And we're going to find them. They pored over every shred of intelligence. They interviewed the few pilots who had survived an encounter, and they found the chinks in the jet's armor. The Mi-262's greatest strength was its speed in a straight line, but it accelerated slowly. Its Jumo 004 turbojet engines were temperamental, slow to spool up from idle to full power, and it was vulnerable during its most delicate phases, takeoff and landing. So, the hunters adapted. They went back to their oldest, most brutal tactic, rat catching. But now, they were hunting rats that could turn into falcons. They would loiter near the known Mi-262 airfields, like Akmer and Hizapi, hiding in the clouds or using the sun for cover. They'd wait, there are 2,800 engines rumbling patiently. Then they'd see it. A jet would begin its takeoff roll. It was at its most vulnerable, low, slow, fuel-heavy. The pilot focused on his instruments. Now, a flight of Thunderbolts would peel off from their hiding place and dive. They wouldn't have much time. Maybe 30 seconds. They had to kill the jet before it could retract its gear and unleash its devastating speed. It was a deadly game of seconds. The Jug pilots would push their throttles through the gate, water injection flooding the cylinders, the big double wasp screaming as they hurtled towards the runway. The German ground crews would scatter. Flak towers would open up, filling the air with steel. The Mi-262 pilot, seeing the shadows racing across the tarmac, would be frantically trying to get his engines to full power, willing his speed to build. Sometimes he made it. He'd become a shrinking dot on the horizon, safe. But sometimes, a young lieutenant named James J.J. McDonough was on one of these patrols. He saw a 262 start its roll. He led his flight down. The flak was intense, black smudges everywhere. He ignored it, focusing on the silver jet. He could see the pilot's helmeted head in the cockpit. He fired a long, sweeping burst from 800 yards out, walking his tracers towards the target. His .50 caliber rounds chewed up the concrete runway, then found the Mi-262's wing. He saw pieces fly off. The jet swerved, its landing gear collapsing. It skidded off the runway in a shower of sparks and flame. McDonough didn't wait to watch. He was already pulling back on the stick, his wings trembling as he clawed for altitude, tracers from the flak towers following him all the way up. He just helped destroy a wonder weapon. Not by outflying it in a dogfight, but by being smarter, by being patient, by using the Thunderbolt's ruggedness to survive the hellish flak over its airfield. Other weaknesses were exploited. The Mi-262 couldn't turn well at high speed. Its engines were prone to flaming out if the pilot jerked the throttle. So, the P-47 pilots, if they were caught by a jet, would break into its attack, forcing the German pilot to make a high-speed, turning shot, which was incredibly difficult. It was a desperate, terrifying maneuver, but it worked. The jet would overshoot, and for a few precious seconds, as it slowed to turn around, it was vulnerable. The Thunderbolt, the plane designed for a different era of warfare, was holding its own against the future. It was a testament to the sheer, brutal effectiveness of its design and the courage of the men who flew it. The Mi-262 was a Ferrari. The P-47 was a bulldozer. And in the messy, chaotic, and unforgiving reality of war, sometimes the bulldozer wins. By the spring of 1945, the end was in sight. The Thunderbolt's war was almost over. It had done everything asked of it and more. It had won air superiority. It had shattered the German army on the ground. And it had even battled the jets to a bloody stalemate. The final missions were a mopping-up exercise, but no less deadly. The skies were officially cleared, but the flak never stopped. On a strafing run against a last, desperate pocket of resistance, the legendary Gabi Gabreski's luck finally ran out. He was flying too low, his prop actually chopping the top off a small hill, and he was forced to crash land. He spent the final months of the war as a POW. It was a stark reminder that in this war, no one was invincible. But the Thunderbolt's legacy was secure. The numbers were staggering. P-47 pilots were credited with destroying over 7,000 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. They had dropped over 130,000 tons of bombs. They had fired countless rockets and millions of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. They had done it all in a plane that was, by the war's end, considered obsolete by the new standard of jets and the sleek P-51 Mustang. But the Mustang couldn't have done what the Jug did. It couldn't have taken the punishment, carried the bomb load, or survived the brutal environment of low-altitude ground attack. The P-47 was the anvil upon which the Luftwaffe was broken. The Mustang was the scalpel that finished the job. The final, ironic triumph of the P-47 came not from its guns or its bombs, but from its sheer, unkillable presence. As the Allied armies raced into Germany, they overran Luftwaffe airfields. And on those airfields, they found rows of brand new, advanced fighters, FW-190D9s, even a few Mi-262s, lined up and waiting. They had been rendered useless. They had no fuel. Their pilots were dead or captured. Their supply lines had been severed. And who had severed those supply lines? Who had destroyed the fuel depots and the trains carrying the parts? The P-47s. The Jugs had won the war by making it impossible for the enemy to fight back. The weapon that had been dismissed as a joke had, in the end, silenced its critics with the most final of arguments: total victory. The guns fell silent in May 1945. The Thunderbolts were flown to vast storage depots, the boneyards. The shark's teeth and pin-up girls painted on their noses faded in the sun. The mighty R-2800 engines were silenced for good. For many, it was the end of the line. They were scrapped, melted down into ingots to become washing machines and cars for the peace they had helped to win. But the story of the Jug wasn't over. Its toughness and payload made it the perfect platform for the new, fledgling Air Force in the early days of the Cold War. It served as a reconnaissance plane, a test bed, and most famously, as the F-47 in the air forces of dozens of nations across the globe. It saw combat again in the Korean War, once again proving its worth as a ground attack aircraft. But its greatest legacy isn't in metal and wire. It's in the lessons it taught. It taught the world that underestimation is a fatal disease. The Germans looked at the P-47 and saw a clumsy brute. They failed to see the revolutionary turbo-supercharger system, the incredible durability, the devastating firepower. They saw the surface and it cost them the war in the air. It taught a lesson in American ingenuity. The P-47 wasn't a copy of anything. It was a radical, original solution to the problem of air combat, born from the minds of immigrants who believed in a simple, brutal philosophy: build it strong, build it powerful, and make it survive. And it taught a lesson about the men who flew them. They weren't born aces. They were farm boys, mechanics, college students. They were given a tool that was misunderstood, and through courage, intelligence, and sheer force of will, they learned to master it. They turned a failure into one of the most successful and versatile weapons of the Second World War. Today, only a handful of P-47s remain, meticulously restored, their engines once again roaring to life at air shows. When you stand near one as it taxis by, you don't just see a museum piece. You feel it. You feel the deep, rumbling power vibrating in your chest. You smell the oil and the high-octane fuel. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes. The echo of Hub Zemke's voice on the radio. The echo of Gabi Gabreski's guns. The echo of a young pilot from Ohio, scared out of his mind, trusting a 7-ton beast to bring him home. The P-47 Thunderbolt was more than a plane. It was a symbol of resilience. A symbol of the idea that it's not the prettiest or the most elegant that wins, but the one that can take a punch and keep on swinging. The one that refuses to die. The Luftwaffe's aces dismissed it, until 8.50 calibers rained 6,000 rounds per minute, and taught them the price of their arrogance. This story, the story of the Jug, is your story. It's a story that belongs to anyone who's ever been counted out. Anyone who's ever been laughed at for being too big, too slow, too different. The next time you face a challenge that seems impossible, the next time someone tells you that you can't do something, I want you to remember the Thunderbolt. Remember that sometimes, brute force and a thick skin are the most elegant solutions of all. Remember that the flaw everyone mocks might just be your greatest hidden strength. What's the P-47 in your life? What are the 8.50 calibers you can bring to a fight that no one sees coming? This history was written by the courageous and paid for by the brave. If you want to ensure these stories are never forgotten, then become a part of this community. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear about an underdog's triumph, and subscribe to keep their legacy alive. The cockpit is open. We're just keeping the seat warm for you.